SQLAlchemy. And particularly what's it called? The curriculum will talk about object relational mappers. And the key part you should think is object. So our object right here, we're going to create objects to help us basically map to our database. So it's actually a really, really useful tool we can use because, again, most programming is written in object-oriented programming. I just shared you guys the Colab notebook. Again, you can edit it and research this. You can look at it later too. Let me know though if it doesn't work, if you guys go into it and it says you have no permission, because it happened a couple times. But SQLAlchemy basically will be a library that we'll use a lot in like Python and for data science, because it allows us to like think in programming language, but connect it to like a SQL server, basically our database. And I found one that in particular was this group right here. Or I don't know if it's actually a group, it might be just one person. But they basically wrote a whole bunch of little quick, like essentially a cheat sheet of like, oh, you want to set a database URL? Let's hear later on. It says, oh, create a specific table. And it shows you kind of like what patterns you'd kind of look at. So I think that's really useful to do and everything. Okay, so I linked that into this Colab notebook. So definitely check that out. This is the actual GitHub right here, but it's the same thing, this website. Okay, so let's go into SQLAlchemy. Hold on, guys. My dog's kind of being loud. I'll be back in like half a second. So sorry about that, guys. I just knew she was gonna get on. Okay, so you guys are probably looking over this code a little bit, and main thing is we have this pack or library, SQLAlchemy, right? And we can use this to actually, what's called, create a connection, basically the object relational mapper. So in this case, if we go ahead and import this, right, we can create this thing called an engine. And the way I kind of imagine the engine when we think of like SQLAlchemy, I don't know if this is the perfect analogy, but I kind of think of it, it's like it's the car, it's like we're creating an engine. So again, we might not have a musicians.db, it might have already exist, but basically you're saying, okay, this engine is going to be connecting to musicians.db. Okay, and this could be, in this case, it's a file, but you could also have this actually connect to a server on the cloud, like maybe on someone's local server, or it could be in the cloud or whatever, and this would be some type of URL. But in this case, we're just using it for a file. But just know that it's the same idea, just this will be different. And we put this echo true. This comes from the curriculum too, but this will kind of gives a little info about what's going on. Usually though, to be honest, I don't even give that part. I usually would just do this, so it's nice and clean. But since we're learning, we might as well see that information here. Okay, so again, our engine doesn't do anything. We're just kind of like creating it. It's like when you create a car, you can think of like the car's not doing anything when you have the car. You have to actually do something with the car, right? So that we'll get into what that looks like later. And then these parts right here, this is, oh, one thing I should note. You'll just notice that I imported, this is actually wrong, sorry guys. No, whatever. When I imported this, I didn't import it as, I didn't do it from. Note that this will take whatever's in here in this library and we'll import it and be able to use that directly. So create engine is not something I created. Create engines directly from SQLAlchemy, and you can do this. This is fine when we're probably testing, but be very careful to do this. For example, if we just did pandas. Oh, sorry. Oh no, I'm sorry. I'm misspeaking. It's early for me. You'll see the curriculum do what I'm describing. Imports, it'll say like from SQLAlchemy. Import star. Have you guys seen this before? This is a good quick way to like do essentially like do testing stuff, but the problem is it'll import everything from that database, including this create engine. But if I made a function that's called create engine, it will overwrite that part. So you have to be very careful. So usually the better practice is just to import SQLAlchemy like this, or import it as, something like that, and make sure you just keep it consistent. But just know, you be careful. Or later on, we'll see that you can import a specific in this case, a specific function, or I should say method, you could do it that way too. But just be very aware of doing this. This is usually better for testing, not for long-term stuff. Okay, I just wanted to throw that in there because the curriculum does show this. So I created my engine, and this stuff right here basically allows me to, you'll notice this base here. Where have we seen base before? Does anyone remember? Okay, it's a little subtle part. It's when we actually did object-oriented programming, when we did inheritance. So this actually is basically creating an ability for us to use object-oriented programming in SQLAlchemy. Okay, so we'll see how that makes a connection. So I'm just basically importing this part. I'm getting just declarative base. In this case, I'm pretty safe since there's no extra functions. And then you'll see here, this one's a little like, in my mind, like danger zone. Whenever I see star, I'm always like, ooh, careful. But since we're only testing things out, it'll be fine. Just know that the, what's it called? The curriculum uses this import a lot for SQLAlchemy. And just know that in practice, especially for deployment, just be careful with this. Probably knows that for deployment. So anyway, so I just want to show you that. Okay, so now we can actually get into using SQLAlchemy. So if you look back here, this should look actually pretty familiar for the most part. This is object-oriented programming. There was a reason why we did it on one, okay? So we're basically creating a class here for Python, and I'll kind of ignore this part right now, but you can see right here, I made some variables, ID, full name, instrument, DOB, date of birth, and alive, right? And again, this comes from the curriculum, so you can follow along with that later on. And I can do some extra things, but you'll notice things look a little different on this right here. And this is coming from SQLAlchemy. And in fact, you might notice, hey, there's this table name. And basically what's happening here is that we're gonna create a class, a normal Python class, but this is gonna be able to allow us to connect to a SQL database. Basically, we're able to use the class structure to create data. And this can be really useful because then we can kind of think of things as like objects versus lines inside of data. And again, it allows us that flexibility that OOP would normally give us, all right? But the main thing is we give it a table name. So this will actually create a table name and it will end up being actually musicians DB, but we haven't connected it yet, okay? We have basically a table name musician. So we say, hey, all the stuff that's gonna be made from the musician class, whatever case that is, we're using musicians. You notice that has base, so it's inheriting from this declarative base, which is why we're able to use this table name and all these other things, okay? You'll notice that we have an ID because we do have to have a primary key, right? Every table should have, every element should have a primary key, or every table should have a primary key, which is assigned for each element, right? And you'll see right here, column, basically it's like, okay, it's in the column. It's an integer type, right? And then you'll notice it says primary key equals true. This allows us also not to worry about as we add more parts to the database, since primary keys have to be unique, we can just keep adding in more parts and more lines, like more rows into our table without having to worry about what the ID is, right? Imagine trying to keep track of all the numbers for your ID. Like you might as well just say, hey, you know what, you figure it out. And that's what SQLAlchemy does when we set this to primary key, okay? You can see here, full name, column, and then string. So all these parts right here are coming from SQLAlchemy, okay? So you get column integer, foreign key. So this is gonna allow us to connect to it. And foreign key is gonna be related to a table that we haven't created yet called instruments. And it's gonna use the ID of instruments. And that's gonna be its foreign key. And then you can see here, for example, date time, we have a Boolean, okay? So one thing to note is it kind of gives you a clue. And this is one of the reasons why people do import star for SQLAlchemy, because then they don't have to write SQLAlchemy or let's say SA or something like SA.integer, but these all belong to SQLAlchemy. Okay? And note that they're all capital. Does anyone have an idea why they're all capital? Like there's not like a specific, like you can write anything in capital for Python, but does anyone know why we'd want to write these in capital or why these are capital? It's okay. All right. Any guesses though? All right, that's fine.
They're objects.
Ah, there it is. Objects. Good. See? Always good to speak up, right? Always take a guess. Yeah, exactly. Usually in Python, by convention, we capitalize our objects. So that way we know immediately, it's let's say objects, but classes, right? We capitalize our classes. That way we can quickly identify, like, oh, that is a class. And so that's exactly what's going on here. We're actually using classes like integer. We're actually using a class called column, and we're basically inheriting some of that stuff and putting into our other class, musician. So just kind of be aware whenever you see capital letters in Python, you should think, oh, is that a class? Because it probably is. Okay. So I can create this class right here. I can create this class right here, which is instruments. Remember, we referenced that instruments.id. That's what we use for here. And you can see I have ID, name, instrument. Okay. So any questions on how I formatted this or anything like that? Or maybe you've seen like, oh, we could do something else. Okay, cool. All right. Note that you also could have done an init. If you guys remember, like that, right? We could have done that. So that way we didn't have to, we're going to manually have to do full name, instrument, DOB, alive. You could also do some extra stuff, you know, get your setters and getters and stuff like that to help organize. And that's the reason why we talked about OOP, basically, so we can better organize our stuff. But in this case, we're leaving it since it's just simple, or just a simple explanation, simple introduction. Okay. So remember how I said we created our engine earlier? Well, our engine's just sitting there, ready to go. So we need to like start our engine. So we created this engine here. In this case, I'm just redoing the same thing in case it didn't run before. In this case, I'll just run through, see if it gives an error. And then we're gonna start it up with this. And the curriculum talks about this metadata, and there's actually kind of, to be honest, you probably could like not ever look at this, but it's probably important for you to understand what's going on. So the curriculum does go into detail. Basically, it allows us to make sure that our like database and our tables are all set to go. So it kind of preps them up, essentially like starts it up, okay? So this shouldn't give us a thing, okay. And you notice I did echo true, so that means every time I run anything on the engine's gonna basically return stuff. So you can see it's doing some background stuff right here. For the most part, you don't have to really worry about it. But you can see right here when I started up and I created my engine, okay? In this case, I created different instruments, I created a musicians table. So in this case, I didn't have to actually write this stuff myself, right? I just essentially wrote it within these classes. So it's kind of nice. I don't have to like worry about it too much. Okay. So now that we created our engine, we can do CRUD. And does anyone know what CRUD stands for? What's the C stand for CRUD?
Create.
Create, good. So we got create. What's the next one? Does anyone know? You'll see it's a lot, so that's why I'm kind of reviewing it. Update. And then, oh, sorry. I skipped R. Okay. What would R stand for, you think? Read. Okay. So create, read, update, and last one with D. We create something, we can read it, we can update it. What's the last thing we can do with it?
Delete.
Delete it, right? We're going to get rid of it, right? So that's what CRUD is. You'll see CRUD referenced a lot. So just know that that's what it stands for. But basically, it allows us to create things. We can read things. We can update things. We can delete things. So that's what we're talking about. So, okay, let's talk about actually, delete something here? No. Okay, let's actually start talking about how you would do this data. So I'm going to have our musicians and our instruments, and I have this neighbor who plays their drums really loud all the time, so I want to add them into the database, right? So I say, okay, I have my neighbor is a musician, right? So I'm basically instantiating our object. Note that I don't have any extra parameters in here because I didn't write it in it function, but I could have, okay? I do my neighbor is the full name, Bob Ross, or Bob Rose. My neighbor is alive for now, true, okay? And then I also created drums because he's gonna create drums. Note that I didn't put all of the keys right here, or not the keys, the parameters. So earlier we saw that he has, for musicians, an ID. I didn't write any of that. There's a full name, instrument, date of birth. I don't know who his date of birth, but I know he's alive. And in this case, there's also instruments, right? I don't have an instrument created yet. So this is what I can do is actually create this instrument. Drums equals instruments. I'm instantiating the object. Drums.name equals drums. Okay. Drums.instrument type. I don't really know too many about instruments, but I know it's loud. So I just put this type is loud. Okay. And then this case, we use this ID for drums. So I do have my neighbor dot instruments equals drums.id. So this will create now in the table, when I actually end up committing it, is basically creating a line for musicians and also for instruments, right? So this allows me to kind of add things in here. And you can kind of see this right here is completely separate from SQL, right? Like if you saw just this by itself, you probably wouldn't think of using SQL, like you wouldn't think SQLAlchemy at least first. So this allows us to write like functions and classes and basically create objects, and then later put them into our database. Okay. I run this guy, didn't give me any errors, which is good. But now I need to actually put this information into my database. So in this case, I'm making sure I create a session. So you kind of have a few things going on here now, right? You have a connection, you have a cursor, right, from SQLite 3. But now we're talking about, we had, what's it called? An engine. We created our engine. We're creating a session, basically allows us to, you can think of our session kind of like, it's like, okay, now we're going to talk to our database. We're going to use our engine to do CRUD, basically, create, read, update, delete, okay? So you can see here, I'm doing that session maker, which comes from SQLAlchemy. You can see right here. And see object relational mapper. So it allows us to connect that object with the database. Session maker, we're binding it to the engine. We're basically saying, oh, this session will be attached to this engine, so we can use that engine to do everything, okay? And you can see our session is equal to session. Basically, I'm instantiating a new object here. So now I have this new object called session that I can start doing things, for example, adding information. So I can run this part right here. And then in this case, session.addAll, kind of self-explanatory. I'm going to add everything that's in here. In this case, my neighbor and drums to my database, and then I'll do a commit. Okay, and so before actually I do that, I did want to show you one part. So if I do drums.id, you'll see that, oops, well, first of all, I have to spell drums right, but drums.id, you'll see that it doesn't give me anything. There's nothing there, which makes sense. I didn't give it an ID, right? But when we commit it over to the database will basically, SQLAlchemy will do that for me and will assign a drums ID because it's a primary key. So you can see here, this is all echoed. Normally you wouldn't see this if you didn't have echo, but you can see it's basically beginning the engine, it's inserting, this is the SQL, what's it called? The SQL query, instruments, name, instrument type. Did I give it those things? Okay. And then, oh, sorry, there's the values. Drums, none, insert into, so you can see those parts. So now if I do drums.id, you can actually see, I get an ID of 1. Okay, so you can just know that this is like the, what's it called? The SQL query. One thing you guys might be saying, wait, what's this, these question marks? So does anyone, well, okay, let you guys know. These are basically like parameters in there. So you can think of when SQLAlchemy does this, this is the first parameter, drums. This is the second parameter, none. Which in this case shouldn't actually be, did I spell that wrong? Instrument type. Oh yeah, I see I didn't spell instrument type wrong, right? See that? So it gave me none. So this case, the value is going to be none right now, but it'll just have the name drums. And you can see here the different one, full name, instrument, date of birth, alive. I didn't give it, I gave it his name. I didn't give the instrument directly because I have the ID here, and we run this through, but I have now drums ID. In fact, I can do musicians, oops, my neighbor. You can see I can get a query right there, and I can see its ID of 1. Okay, cool. So this is kind of how you insert stuff. There's more information about how to do more. Oops, that's my same one. In the curriculum, there's more information on like how to like update things and do that. Again, that reference I showed at the very beginning, this one right here, you'll see that they'll have things, for example, like how to get database. For example, if you want to update the data, it'll go through this whole thing of how you would update, and you can kind of read it through, seeing how this would work. So these are some nice shortcuts and stuff, a good reference to kind of get an idea of how to make things work. Okay, but it's the same process. Okay. Any questions on how I did this and then what this is doing? Okay, cool. Again, just making our classes, and then we're using SQLAlchemy to take our objects and tying it over directly into our engine, which basically adds it into our database. So now after the database exists, we can actually use SQLAlchemy to access everything. So the first thing you might want to do if you got a new database, for example, okay, is you actually want to see what's in the database. So first of all, I want to access it. You can see this part right here. I'm creating a new engine, assuming like I'm making a new thing, right? I'm getting database name. I just did this just to make it a little more formatted. I'm making my new session. So I run this, shouldn't get any errors, good. And then now I can get info about my database. So again, I'm looking at this new thing called inspect. So now we have a new thing. We have session, we have an engine, we have inspect. So inspect basically allows us to just look at our database, and we're using the engine to inspect our stuff, okay? So you can see we can actually get the table names. So we can say, oh, well, I don't know what this database is. Let me check out the table names. In this case, we should see instruments and musicians. Makes sense, okay? And then for this guy right here, we can actually use an inspector. We can use inspect, right? That inspect object, okay, to get the columns, right, for that table. So in this case, if I do this, you will see it's actually a dictionary, right? And this represents, for our table right here, all the different parts. So for example, I have instrument type. Let's see, our name, ID, okay. Oh, did I put instruments? Yeah, okay. So this allows us to basically check that out. In fact, if I wanted to look at just, let's say I wanted to do, I don't want to look at all of it. I just want to look at, like instead of all this information, I just want the name and I want to know what type it is. I can do like for C in calls, right? Basically it's a list of dictionaries. So I'll get out a dictionary. So I'm getting a single column. I'll call it column. Okay. So for column, for C in columns, and then I can just go ahead and print out, and then my F string. So in this case, I'm going to print out its name. And then I also, why are we having difficulty today? Okay. I want its name, and then I'll have also, let's say its type. So I have C, and I can get, in this case, its name. Okay. Basically, what is it called in this column? Okay. Oops. I spelled it column. And then what do we call it? Oh, I just realized this is going to give me issues. I have to use double quotes here, right? Because otherwise it'll end the string early or prematurely. Okay, so sorry. So column, and then I want the type, right? You see these are just elements that are in here. So now if I do this, you can see that I'm getting for each column, I'm getting the ID or the name and the type. In this case, it's the ID, it's just an integer, name, which is a varchar, basically a string, okay? And an instrument type, which is also a varchar. If I want to look at musicians, or is it musician or musician? I think it's musicians. I can now see the ID, integer, right? Full name, instrument, date of birth, alive. So this gives me some information about the database beforehand. And you can, like, I think the curriculum actually writes a function, so you don't have to keep writing this part over and over again, which can be really useful. But the idea here is that you can query the database through kind of like very equivalent Python kind of familiarities that we have. We can also write a query. So first of all, any questions on what's going on here? Thumbs up if you're feeling pretty good, sideways, down. Okay, see a couple thumbs, some sideways. All right, so we can also use a query, right? So we can execute a query with SQLAlchemy. So in this case, I have my connection here, right, from my engine. In this case, I just called it Q for query, right? In this case, I'm going to select star from instruments, right? And so this should give me all in the data from instruments. So I run this now, and you'll see this got fetch all, so I can get all the elements. You can see it's a list, right, of tuples. So if I actually created multiple, let's say if I created another, so I do the same thing, but I create a new stuff. Let's say I call like John. Unfortunately, he just passed away, and we'll call it like, I don't know, harp. And I'm just giving it a type of quiet. Okay, so I'm just doing that, and I'm committing it. Oops, I have to, oh, that's the same thing. Okay, so now you can see if I try now actually getting this information, you'll see that there'd be multiple things. So you can see that it's a list of tuples. In this case, a list of, the list is basically about drums, and the list is about harp. Okay. And again, this allows me to quickly, like if I know it's a structure, I know it's just a list in tuples, I don't have to worry about any funky kind of stuff. I can just use that and basically process that data like normal. So this allows us to actually start combining with pandas, because pandas is like, well, it's expecting Python kind of stuff. So SQLAlchemy can allow us to basically create a data frame. That's what this PD data frame is. And we can use that query. Okay. In this case, I'm going to do insert instance. Okay. So we can actually use this query now and actually import that into the data frame. And you'll actually see now is that we have a nice little data frame right here. If you wanted to get the columns, for example, we'd have to probably go through here and get column names and then tie that into our data frame, get columns and stuff like that, which I think the curriculum actually shows how to do. But the point is here is that we can now connect this directly into pandas. One thing that I hear a lot of people kind of say is like, well, why can't I just get the whole database and just put it into data frame? Or if it's like a CSV, can I just import it directly into data frame? And you could. There's not like a real reason why you can't do that stuff. But sometimes, like I said, it makes more sense to use a SQL query, since that way, for example, we can connect directly to the database, get all that information versus asking from them, say, let's say either you use an external program or you're asking them, say, hey, can you give me a CSV of all your data? You can just say, hey, how can I connect to your database? And they can give you the information, maybe login info, depending on like read and write access. And then you can basically use that query and connect directly here and then get what you want in pandas. Also, like I said, some things are more efficient in SQL. So for example, if you need to do some quick information, it's like, oh, I only want this information from it, or I need to basically restrict this information, you can do that on SQL and then get that into pandas. So for example, if you're going to get a large, like let's say the database is, I'm going to make something up, like 50 gigabytes, right? You could technically get that whole 50 gigabit of data from just select star from all the tables and put into your data frame. But that's going to take a long time over an internet connection, right? But what you could do is say, well, I only need certain aspects, and that's going to limit significantly. You can basically write a SQL query and say, hey, only give me these things where this is true. And then it'll reduce that significantly and just get that small part versus trying to get the whole thing and then sorting through that whole thing yourself. So again, those are the advantages of why you do SQL and pandas together. Okay, cool. So that kind of ends everything that I have to say. I would say read this more. This gives them more detail. This is from the curriculum, right? If you go into more detail, this will give more detail about using SQLAlchemy, some extra stuff that you can do. Obviously, it can only talk about so much within an hour, but you can see here that it goes into details about using raw SQL statements, tying it into data frames itself. Again, a lot more detail. And even this is probably, there's so much more. So just know that there's always more for you to learn, but at least hopefully you get the concept of tying these things together. Okay.